Today's event is called Islamic Spirituality, the Search for Meaning. We haven't had a talk like this throughout the week, so hopefully this will shed light on a different aspect of Islam. Our speaker for tonight, this afternoon, not tonight. Our speaker for this afternoon is Abdullah al Andalusi, who is a Muslim thinker, speaker and researcher. He tours the UK, frequently giving talks on various topics. We're very honored to have him come all the way down today to deliver this talk. And without further ado,
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الصلاة والسلام على الكريم محمد وعلى آله الطيبين وصحبه الصالحين. I greet you all the Islamic greetings of peace. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. May the peace and blessings of God be upon you all. It was a very interesting topic which I was asked to deliver about spirituality. And we've all heard and used the word spirituality quite a lot, many times in our lives. We generally use it to refer to actions that do not produce any particular material product or benefit, but are done seeking an intent, normally outside the material world. Many of us are used to dividing the material world and spirituality from each other. And therefore the material world is this world, and the spiritual world is usually attributed to some other transcendent world. But if we put our assumptions aside, we must ask, what do we know about the material world and about this other world? Of course, materialists would deny any other world except the material world, which they define as the universe of tangible and tactile objects. I say materialist and not atheist because someone can actually be an atheist and still believe in forms of spirituality. There are types of Buddhism which doesn't require you to believe in a God. Those who are not materialists believe that there is a spiritual world that exists somehow outside the universe or parallel to it, that transcends it, where human souls can reach through attaining some developed spiritual rank or capability, or that can be attained only when the human being dies. However, I would argue that both the materialists and the spiritualists are wrong, at least according to the Islamic concept of spirituality. And allow me to explain. So let's take the material universe that materialists are so fond of. They say that only material things exist, only tangible things, only tactile things, things you can touch, feel, and smell. However, there are quite a lot of other things in this universe which are not material, which no one would contest their existence. For example, just observing the universe, we see that all these material objects behave towards each other with a set of regularities in their behavior. These regularities we call laws, like the law of gravitation, laws of motion, laws of entropy, the laws of thermodynamics. Why are they called laws? It's because every time we see these objects of which these laws describe behave to each other, they behave in this very consistent manner. And so we call these things laws. Of course, this consistency or laws in itself are not material. So how these who or what determined the behavior of these objects, obviously is a discussion we'll come to. But their behavior, their regularity, isn't a material thing. Now, of course, science is all about investigating the laws, how objects behave towards each other. But I would argue that the biggest and most significant immaterial phenomenon is consciousness. The very thing that materialists use to experience the material world they love so exclusively. The mind, knowledge, feeling, emotions, concepts of justice, equality, maths, poetry, and art are not material things. Included in knowledge is meaning. Meaning is not a material thing and doesn't exist materially. Sure, you can write a book using language which encodes meaning. However, all the material universe can see is ink on a piece of paper wrapped up by some leather, nothing more. There's a clock in this, there's the clock up here. If you look at that clock, if a materialist or the material universe, if it could ever look at things, was to look at that clock, all it would see is a device that moves and rotates twice per rotation of the sun, or rather rotation of the earth going about its axis. Nothing more. It is consciousness that gives that clock meaning, that gives those particular symbols a particular understood meaning. This also shows something very important, that something can be immaterial without being spiritual. No one says that their study of mathematics was a spiritual experience, unless you really, really love maths. But it's not, maths is not material. Maths just describes relationships between things. In fact, actually, I would dare say that mathematics, certainly more than the empirical sciences, attains definite and certain knowledge. Its theorems cannot be refuted because mathematics is definite. 2 + 2 = 4. You don't have to observe that to know it is true. And it will always be true. However, in the empirical world, we only have theories about the material objects, how they operate, and many of those theories are proven wrong over time after we observe the universe using improved equipment and so on and so forth. So I would say mathematics is actually produces much more definite knowledge than science does, or rather observation of the universe. Because your observation, how do you know for certain that what you are describing is an accurate depiction of the reality of that thing? And if anyone doubts that, I'll just give an example. If any scientist here in the audience would like to define to me energy, I would be interested to know what the definition of energy actually is. What it is. What actually is energy? If you have a definition, please give it to me. But we talk about it all the time. The whole world around us is surrounded by energy. We use that word so ubiquitously, and yet what is the definition of the word energy? Let's say, oh, energy is something that makes something do. No. That's what it does. What is it? Right? Don't know. And yet they speak so confidently about the observation of the material world, and yet they can't describe the most fundamental and most ubiquitous aspect of it, energy. You, sir?
Define anything not in relation to the way it interacts with the world around it.
Well, I would say that if I say, what is a human being composed of? We can describe it's made of cells. So what is energy? What is energy composed of?
What is a cell?
Okay, and then we can describe, using a diagram, what the cell is, what it looks like, and so on. We can actually have a description of, it's a membrane of some kind, and it has particular components in it. We can describe what it is. Yes, we can. That's the whole point. Like what is a house? No one says a house is only described by its capacity to give shelter. Right? A house has a particular description. So that's what we have, a definition of a description of something, so what it is, and we describe separately what it does. These are two different things. They're not the same. One and the same thing.
I mean, most of the descriptions of the house you would give would be in relation to observations you make, not in relation to what the core essence of the house is. You don't define a house in terms of house stuff. Define it in terms of how it looks.
Okay, so what does energy look like?
Well, I mean, it depends.
And what does it? Well, look, with a house. Okay, just to continue. So with a house, we look at the house. We know it generally has they must have some kind of a structure of some kind. It could vary depending on the type of house. Maybe you live in a Hobbit house or something, or you live in a standard British Industrial Revolution era house. It doesn't make a difference, but you can describe what it looks like or what it is in essence. So you could say it's something composed of bricks, it's something composed of some material matter which encloses a space. All right, you can make that description, but you don't just simply describe a house purely by what it does. However, I would even argue that even with energy, although we say that energy creates motion or creates movement amongst the smallest subatomic particles, but we don't know how it does that, and we don't even know fundamentally, as I said, what. Energy is really a concept we just created to describe some things that we see, but we don't actually see energy, and we don't actually know what energy actually is. It's actually a theory in of itself to describe motion. For example, people say kinetic energy changes to electrical energy, for example. And say, well, how does that look? Is there a particular energy corpuscle that changes from a kinetic type to electrical type? That's the situation. It is a theory to explain the material world. But my point is,
we do talk about actual packets of energy.
Quanta of energy. But please tell me where you have seen in a microscope or electron microscope or any other way what an energy particle of some kind and what it is. And that's my point. Yeah, you can talk about it. Just using the word quantum doesn't actually mean that, now we've explained it. It actually makes it much more complex, because now you're just moving it from one level to an even more smaller level, but we still don't know what it is.
Well, we have a series of observations that work and only work because of how we understand energy. I mean, it's rather...
No. You have a theory, or we have a theory, rather, of what to explain the observance of what we observe in the natural world, but we don't know what it is, right? So energy, as I said, is a theory introduced to explain what happens in the natural world, but we don't see energy, and we don't know what it's made of. So that's simply my point. That's simply my point. Anyway, just to continue the discussion. So, in terms of, that was the materialists. So materialism doesn't explain everything in the universe, and one also could argue that energy isn't material either. However, as for spiritualism, they also make a mistake, or spiritualists, they make a mistake. It is first to assume that they know anything about the realms outside the material world. Secondly, their claims about what transcends the universe is pure speculation without knowledge given to them or without a means to perceive it themselves. And unless you believe in a communication from the originator of the universe, where this originator reveals knowledge about such things, which people can call, let's say, revelation, to reveal, you cannot know for sure any of these things. Any so-called spiritual experience you might claim might be the subjective experience that you experience from your imagination, or it could even come from a drug-induced delirium. How can you be sure unless something is sent which can be experienced and verified by other people, some means of authentication? Now, as Muslims, we believe in the revelations of the Torah, the Injil, the New Testament Bible, as referred to by Christians, or parts of the New Testament Bible rather, the Quran, as well as many others that have come to humanity throughout humanity's existence, which we believe were accompanied with authentications. However, we believe that these revelations conveyed knowledge of a world that is beyond the material universe, but these worlds are not spiritual ones, in the sense of disembodied spirits floating around in some intangible ether, which most human beings imagine as some kind of smoke or misty realm. No, the world which, as Muslims, we believe in, which is beyond the particular material universe, is also material. You can touch it, you can see it, you can taste it, smell it, and feel it when you're in those worlds. They exist, we believe, right now. The place of judgment in the hereafter, as well as paradise and hell, are all physical places according to the Islamic worldview, not spiritual ones. Sure, the laws of physics there may be a little different, but they are places that can be sensed physically according to Islam, Christianity, and various sects of Judaism. Who told you they wouldn't be so? In fact, they are not spiritual worlds made of non-physical substances, nor existing in different dimensions, whatever that means, but rather they are part of the same material reality of our universe. They just happen to be outside the particular bubble we live according to our worldview. They are physical places and a physical location inhabiting the same reality we do, and I think it's something that you should dwell on for a moment. So if these other places are not spiritual, where lies spirituality? Well, spirituality lies in meaning. And meaning lies in purpose, and not any purpose, but rather the purpose of creation itself, or the purpose of everything that exists. And for something that doesn't have a purpose, it does not have a meaning. So I think the ultimate question is, does anything in this universe have a purpose? Does it have any meaning? And if it does, then what is this meaning? Now, first and foremost, I want to go into something really basic. What is purpose? And therefore, what is meaning? Well, the purpose behind something is always its intent. It can only be described as its intent. So the purpose of this clock is the intent that the clock was built for, which was to measure time. That's its purpose, and therefore you know its intent. So knowing that, we know the meaning of it, and we know that those particular symbols have a meaning related to its purpose, which is they indicate the time of day. So we have to ask the question, does the universe have a meaning? And does our lives have a meaning? And does anything that exists have a meaning? And the only way you could answer that is if you find out if it had a purpose. And the only way you can answer that is if you know if it was intended or not. You have to understand or study or find out whether it was intended. You know, in language, I'll use that as an example, which is used for communication. The speaker invokes concepts within the mind of the listener. It is within this context that the use of words like, for example, cat, bucket, or car, have a purpose. The purpose of each word is to invoke a particular concept in your mind. This is the intended reason for the existence of these words. Therefore, these words have an intention behind their existence, and these words have a meaning. But if something could create itself, then it could define its own intention and therefore its own purpose. But because the act of creating oneself requires one to pre-exist first, to do so, it is rationally absurd. So the intention behind one's existence can only come from an external source, unless one has always pre-existed, and therefore you wouldn't have a purpose behind your existence. But since I'll take it that none of us here have pre-existed eternally, and we can know that rationally, which I'm going to go into, I would say that all of us here was made by something else. And the big question that everyone asks themselves, whether you are atheist or not atheist, is, why am I here? Well, you can explain it through a bunch of material processes, or you can explain it through a bunch of material processes that was ultimately initiated by something that intended it, which is perhaps the theist perspective. But ultimately, we have to ask the first question, which is, how do we know anything actually even has a meaning or purpose in the first place? And to know that, we have to know whether the universe was intended, and to know that, we have to know what created or caused the universe. Now, usually in such discussions, I always infamously bring a rock, and not to throw at people, but rather I bring a rock and I ask the question. So I'm going to ask you to please imagine that this bottle is not a bottle and it is a rock. I should have asked the ISOC before coming. Now, if I was to ask anyone here, if you saw a rock, or there's actually rocks outside you can see, this one question is, how do you know any of these rocks that I saw outside coming here, or this, let's say, imaginary rock I have here, how do we know it was created? How do we know it had a start point? How do we know it wasn't an eternal, infinite object that was never created? Does anyone have any answers? How do you know that this is not an eternal rock? Well, it's an eternal bottle. Well, I could say bottle, but I know what people are going to say, oh, that's a watchmaker argument. You're using a human-created object, and you're saying, how do you know we know that these human-created objects have been created by humans. However, I could counter that you might have seen bottles being created on TV in a factory. Most of you probably haven't gone to a bottle factory. Maybe some of you might have. But did you see this bottle, this particular bottle being created in a factory? Maybe this bottle is the eternal bottle of which all other bottles are based on. Humans discovered this bottle hundreds of thousands of years ago and said, this is a great concept. Let's imitate it and make every other bottle like in its image. How do we know that this particular bottle isn't infinite and eternal? You say.
Well, strictly we don't. It would be most sensible to assume it isn't, because we have layers of explanation that work best on the basis that, like every other bottle we've observed, comes from the bottle-making process. But we don't know beyond 100% certainty.
So you're not sure that this bottle is created?
I'm confident as a human.
You're reasonably confident, but you're not 100% sure this bottle couldn't be eternal. No. So there's a possibility. Are you saying there's a possibility this bottle is eternal?
There's a possibility in the same way there are possibilities.
So you're saying it's possible this bottle is eternal, the infinite bottle which created you, and or is eternal anyway?
Yeah. It's strictly possible that bottle is eternal in the same way it's possible the world is flat, or that the sun is a mirage or something like this. It's not logically impossible, but it doesn't seem likely based on what we know.
Well, firstly, there's a discussion of what do you define as likely? So you're saying that likelihood is just an assumption that because we've seen a whole bunch of other things in one way, that if we see the next iteration of that thing, it might follow what we've seen previously.
Yeah,
which is likelihood is just an assumption. But you're telling me you don't know for certain if this bottle is created or eternal.
You are strictly speaking from a philosophical perspective. No.
No, not from a philosophical perspective, from a common sense perspective. From common sense sometimes isn't so common. From a rational perspective.
No, but from a common sense perspective, I would probably assume you're British because of how you speak, right? But it's possible that,
Maybe I'm very good at accents.
But this is the point. This is the point. Common sense isn't all that useful.
Well, I try to say common sense. Just rationally, just using basic thought. How is it possible that we can know for certain whether this bottle was created or not? And you're saying you can't know for certain.
But what we understand about this, everything we understand about bottle-making processes means that the likelihood of it coming from the bottle-making process is very, very, very high, so that we don't realistically consider the possibility that it's eternal.
I'd be quite...
That sounds absurd when you say it.
Yeah, it does sound absurd, doesn't it? It's strange that. What I would say regarding the bottle is I know for certain that the bottle or a rock that I see outside. Okay, and this is why I prefer the rock rather than the bottle, because there are rocks beyond our telescope range that exists all over this universe, presumably.
So processes that we understand, not that humans.
There are rock-making processes for rocks we see on planet Earth. What about rocks that have fallen from the sky, fallen from space?
Well, we have obviously used some.
How do we know that they're not eternal rocks? These meteorites.
Like I said, strictly we don't. And when we find a rock that doesn't conform to our expectations based on the theories we have about the way that rocks form, we then are presented with issues and we have to say, well, this theory doesn't account for this. So we need to start talking about other ways that rocks can form and look for new ideas.
Why do you... Okay, and here's the point now. Why would we need to look... So if we see a rock that doesn't look like any rock that we know, or doesn't look like it was formed by any process we know, why do we assume it was formed by a different process of which we will now investigate what it is? Why do we assume that? Why don't we just say, oh, there's a rock that has formed under conditions that we're not used to. Hey, maybe it's an eternal rock. Why don't we assume that?
Well, we don't make any assumptions about what did happen.
Well, if you're saying that if we meet a rock that has formed in using processes that no other rock seems to have formed under, or rather it looks different to any other rock we've seen, you said that the first thing we do is we try to find out we investigate the other processes that might possibly exist that create that rock, which comes with the presumption that the rock is created and not an eternal rock. Maybe this new, different kind of rock we encounter is new and different because it's an eternal rock. No one ever assumes that. No one reasonable would ever say that. Why is it? Because I will answer the point of how I know. Because quite simply, it is finite and limited. This bottle, I know it's not an eternal bottle. I'm going to help you out here with giving you some certainty.
As a scientist, how you determine
No, it's something that happens before. See, science is just observation. You look through a telescope or a microscope or a petri dish, or just directly with your eyes. Science, don't be confused by the term. It quite literally is just observation. Nothing more. Recording of data requires language. The assumption of causality requires philosophy, pre-existing concepts. The assumption that the universe follows a regularity of its laws requires philosophy, not science. Right? Science. See, here's the thing, right? Science does assume things. If you study the philosophy of science, the belief that the universal laws are consistent across the universe is an assumption that science makes. But even that said, science, if you really want to break it down, science doesn't actually make any assumptions. It just observes. That's it. The making the theories part, that's human mind, right? The writing the data into numbers, that's the human mind. That's not science. That's mathematics. That's language. If we make an experiment and we modify that experiment slightly and it produces a different result and we record that, it's because we modified the experiment slightly, that possibly was a factor while it created a different result, is the understanding of causality, which is a rational process in the mind to understand causality, not science. Science doesn't make any assumptions, yes, but it doesn't do anything else except observe. Quite literally, change the word science to observation, and that's it. That's pretty much what it is. The idea that science is some kind of ideology or some kind of anything more than just observation are 21st century fallacies and myths which we've kind of accrued onto it. And not to be confused with the scientific method, of which there's a method that was developed over time and it's arguably still being developed to this day, refined and so on, to improve the accuracy of observation. But let me return back to my first point, and we can save this for the Q&A, because we're going to stall this lecture. Q&A, come back with your contentions. So, my point is that I know for certain this bottle is created, and I know for certain that every particular rock that I will see, no matter how weird and strange and different to any other rock I might have seen, I know that it is created is because it is finite and limited. And so, what I mean by that is, this particular bottle is not twice as big as what it is. It's not half as big as what it is. It's got kind of a black label with some blue coloration. It's not an orange label with green coloration, for example. It is its particular color. So the question is, what defined this bottle to be only this particular size with its particular attributes of color? What defined that? So let's go through the possibilities, right? The bottle defined itself. The bottle chose to be this size with this coloration on it. Problem with that is, in essence, what you're saying is the bottle created itself, and that produces a contradiction because the bottle would have to exist first in order to do anything. And if it doesn't exist, how can it create itself? The second possibility is that the bottle literally just popped into existence just the way it is, which is absurd. And the third possibility is that something else made the bottle and defined it with the particular size and shape and coloration. This works with bottles. This rational process works with rocks, because intuitively, even if you don't understand that process, every human being knows when it sees something limited or finite that it was created by something. It was defined by something intuitively. And this is the basis of all human thought on causality. Deny that and you deny causality. You might as well throw causality out of the window. But there's no way you can deny it, because the only way you can deny it is by accepting an absurdity or a contradiction. The bottle made itself. Does that sound plausible? Or the bottle appeared from nothing. And before anyone mentions it, I know they're going to mention, there's a theory, and yes, this is a theory, as in a speculation, that there exists in a pure vacuum a kind of quantum foam or quantum sea, which there's all these different particles, or quantum particles are hitting each other, and at some point they collide at some point and create matter. And people say, so that's what if things can pop into existence. I say, well, no, in that theory, you're actually saying the opposite. There is an existing quantum sea that exists, and then within that sea there are certain collisions or certain things happen, which then cause observable matter to pop into existence. But you're not saying it's from nothing, though. That's still not from nothing. You see, so do not be fooled by a lot of what's called scientific theories. These are basically just speculations, including the concept of the multiverse, which I'll get to in a bit. So, if we know that this object was created because it is a finite limited object, and we know a rock is created because it's a finite limited object, and we know that I'm created because I'm a finite limited object, then we have to answer the question, ultimately, of all the finite limited objects that exist in the universe, what ultimately created all of them? Now, people might say, well, Abdullah, how do you know that the universe is an infinite, or the universe, how do you know it's a finite limited? Have you seen the entire universe? I say, well, you misunderstand. The universe, in the definition of the word, really means everything that exists. That's pretty much what it means. The universe means everything that exists. So I'm not talking about the universe, which is the parts of everything that exists, which is infinite. I'm talking about only the finite parts of what exist. Ultimately, we have to explain where they came from. So, where did the finite part of the universe, or let's just call it the universe for short, the universe, where did it come from? How was it made? Well, we don't know how. We have to hopefully investigate using certain materialist research processes, science, which I might add the Islamic civilization contributed to, like Ibn Haytham, but that's a different discussion. We on the how process, but that we know the universe had an origin point, or a beginning, is absolutely certain, because the universe is finite, it is limited, it has certain laws in it, and it has certain configuration. I don't know how big the universe is. I don't know all the laws of the universe. I don't need to. All I know is it's finite, limited. I don't need to know more than that, because either it's limited or it's not limited. Either it's finite or it's not finite. There's no third option. So then, the finite universe, what creates it? There are only two possibilities. Just two possibilities. The first possibility is something else that was finite created the universe. Something else that was limited, like the universe, created the universe. Let's say, in one particular theory, the Big Bang and Big Crunch theory, which is basically that, the universe maybe came from a Big Bang, but that was the result of a big crunch of a previous universe which kind of collapsed in on itself, and then it blew up again and became this universe. Maybe there was a prior universe, or maybe there was some other mechanism other than this universe which created this universe, and not a finite limited mechanism. Maybe that's a possibility. Maybe that actually is a possibility. We don't know how big the universe is, and if that did exist, there were other universes that made our universe, they too would actually be technically part of our universe too, because they are also in existence and they are finite and limited. But I digress. Some people say, well, how do we know there wasn't an infinite chain of pre-existing universes? So we had this universe was created by a previous dying universe, that was created by a previous dying universe, that was created by a previous dying universe, ad infinitum. Well, there's a rational problem with that argument. You would require an infinite chain of pre-existing universes, an infinite number of pre-existing universes, to be transversed before reaching this one. What do I mean by that is, in essence, it's like me saying, that before this lecture began, the ISOC came out and said, Abdullah's arriving, he'll be arriving in an infinite amount of time, so just wait. If it takes an infinite amount of time for me to arrive in this lecture, would I ever arrive? An infinite amount of time, I would never arrive. And if I said that you could only leave this lecture after an infinite amount of time has passed, as riveting as though the lecture might be, you would be very despondent, because that would mean that you would never leave the lecture. So if I had to tell you, or anyone told you, that for this universe to come into existence required an infinite chain of other universes or other things, all creating each other, leading up to this point, we would never reach this universe. And ultimately, the question's never answered. Another analogy I like to use is, a domino rally. If you put one domino here and you put one behind it, you put one behind it, and you say that domino can't move until the domino behind it hits it. And if I was to create an infinite chain of dominoes, would any of them ever fall down? Or perhaps another analogy I like to use is, there might be like a sandwich dispenser machine in the university. There probably is. Usually most universities there are. So say I wanted to get a sandwich and it cost, let's say, £1. But I didn't have any money. So I asked this sister here for £1. And she didn't have any money. And she asked her friend. And her friend didn't have any money. And she asked her friend. And she didn't have any money. So on and so forth. If an infinite amount of people were asked, all that didn't have any money, would I ever get that £1 for the sandwich? Would I? No. It has to begin with one person saying, oh yes, I have £1 to start the chain going, with that £1 being lent to each person eventually reaching me. There has to be someone that starts that process going, or gives it to me directly, whichever process. So ultimately, we call this infinite regress fallacy for short in philosophy. So infinite regress fallacy can't work, doesn't exist. You can't have an infinite chain of things. The only other possibility is that ultimately, whatever started this chain of creation going, or leading to us, or create us directly, whatever it is not finite, is not limited. Otherwise known as infinite, unlimited. The word infinis in Latin means not finite. And same with unlimited. It has no limitations, has no particular defined characteristics that it couldn't change, or that it was defined for itself. So something that's not finite, not limited. Okay, it can only be that, there's no other possibility. But of course, someone could say, that's great, maybe we even concede that. But how do you know it isn't this infinite force you talk about, this infinite, unlimited thing? How do you know it has a will, or it has intent? Because remember what I said in this lecture, for there to be meaning in this universe, meaning in human life, there has to be intent behind it, right? An intention behind our existence, behind everything in this universe. So maybe this infinite force or thing is a mindless force, a mindless thing. It just creates universes. There is a particular theory that fits that bill, which some people call it the multiverse theory. People get confused as to what that actually means. Some people think it just means there's infinite amount of universes, and other people believe it to be the thing that creates infinite amount of universes. So let's go with that latter description. So they believe the multiverse is a kind of almost like a mechanical kind of thing that creates universes. And the argument is that if you think this universe seems suited towards life, towards human life, it's only because there's an infinite amount of universes. And if you have an infinite amount of universes with infinite possibilities, eventually you're going to get one particular universe that will be suited for life and our condition. There goes their argument, right? But there's a little problem with that. Well, actually, a big problem with that is, why does the multiverse make universes? Not answered. This multiverse, this mechanistic process, why is it making universes? No one asks that question. And what I mean by that is, so this multiverse is producing universes. What is making it do it? There are two possibilities. One, something outside the multiverse is forcing it or pushing it to make universes. Like if you have an infinite factory assembly line, someone's pressing the button. And of course, if that was the case, then whatever's pressing that button is the ultimate cause, not the universe and everything that exists, not the multiverse, which would then mean the multiverse isn't the first cause. And then you'd have to answer, then what is making that multiverse? Is that first cause and so on? So that can't work. The second possibility is the multiverse has an internal mechanism that makes it create universes. Like a clock has an internal mechanism that makes it move, right? Of course, we then have to ask the question, what is making that internal mechanism make universes? Or maybe there's a smaller mechanism inside that. Okay, great. And what's making that smaller mechanism make universes? Okay, maybe there's even smaller mechanism inside that. Like, it's like a babushka doll. You open it up and it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. There's a big problem with this. It's like answering that this clock works because there's a smaller clock inside that. And inside that smaller clock, there's an even smaller clock. And inside that, there's an even smaller clock. Ad infinitum. So an infinite amount of smaller and smaller clocks moving the hands on that face. There's a problem with that, if you've already noticed it. Infinite regress fallacy again. For the hands on that clock to move, you're saying it requires an infinite chain of clocks all moving each other to move that hand on that face of that clock. If that hand required and had to wait for an infinite amount of clocks to basically move each other, it wouldn't move. And what would be the first clock that moves all the other clocks? It wouldn't exist. So infinite regress fallacy couldn't exist. The multiverse couldn't have an infinitely smaller mechanism inside it, because you're just now saying that's an infinite regress fallacy. And it couldn't be something else higher than the multiverse, making the multiverse do what it's doing, because then the multiverse isn't the first cause. It's this higher thing. So the only possibility is the multiverse doesn't make sense. The only possibility, quite literally, the only other possibility is that whatever this infinite, all-powerful force is that created the universe, or created all the universes, or however many they are, I don't know, it did it on its own initiation. It initiated it itself, without any compulsion, by any smaller mechanism or outside mechanism. We have a word for this, for something that initiates actions of its own, of its own volition. It's called will. It has will. And if it has will, then when it makes a universe, the universe is intended. So this ultimate first cause, when it made us, we were intended to exist. And if there's an intention behind our existence, then our existence has a meaning. Because meaning is only defined as intention. That's what meaning is. So I could argue I don't need to empirically see this, only because it's quite literally the only possibility that doesn't run into contradictions and fallacies. There's no other possibility. And this is quite fascinating because the Quran, it tells the human reader to think about these things, to actually come to that conclusion. The Quran says, and we believe this is God speaking, and we did not create the heaven and the earth and that which is between them aimlessly. That is the assumption of those who disbelieve. And this is very fascinating. If you assume, in essence, if you're saying the universe has no meaning, even though the universe was intended to exist, this is your assumption. This is you making the assumption on that. And just a little anecdotal side point I always find funny is I sometimes hear the argument. They say, I don't believe in God, just like I don't believe in unicorns, fairies, and goblins. They always try to bring some fantastical creature, fairies, unicorns, fairies, and goblins. I say, okay. Then you ask them, what do you believe created the universe that has life in it? That was a universe that has a life that could think and observe the universe and think about the origins of the universe and come to the conclusion of a creator. What do you think? How do you explain that? And I say, I believe there's an infinite amount of universes that were created by the multiverse, which have infinite possibilities, and we just happen to be the one that was conducive for human life. I say, that's very fascinating. Because, taking your logic to its natural conclusion, if there's an infinite amount of universes with infinite possibilities, that must mean, I think that girl gets it, that must mean that in one of these universes, there's a unicorn. Another universe, there's a goblin. And in another one universe, there must be a fairy. Infinite possibilities, right? And Lord of the Rings happened in one universe, and Game of Thrones happened in another universe. It must be infinite possibilities, right? Infinite possibilities. That's what they argue. Right? And I say, well, in response, looks like you actually believe in goblins, fairies, and unicorns, not me. Because according to their theory, they'd have to exist. And so that is just as a small anecdotal aside there. So reflect upon that, right? Reflect upon this. The creator of the heavens and the earth intended to create a universe that produced you. Your life, your particular life as well. Not just, okay, there's billions of other humans, yes, but you specifically as well. your lifespan, everything that happened to you today, including you coming here, was all intended to happen, then your life has meaning. And if you're intended to exist, and if everything in the universe seems to operate on laws, like law of gravitation, law of enthalpy, law of entropy, what is our law? What's the law for our creation? How are we meant to live? What should we be doing, and what shouldn't we be doing? Because we seem to have the capacity to intellectualize this. We have the capacity to make choices. Some disagree about whether free will exists. If you're a materialist, you have to disagree that free will exists. If you're a materialist, you have to believe free will doesn't exist. And of course, then you can't even justify why people should even have freedom, because if free will doesn't exist, why give people freedom then? Whereas, at least we have the basis to argue that people have the right to make choices, because you have free will, the capacity to make choices. And what is free will? How can you determine it in a material universe? But we have the basis to argue that. We have the basis to argue that there's free will. So whatever made us to have the capacity to observe the universe around us, think about it, and come to this very conclusion I'm presenting today. To come to knowledge of the Creator. The Creator made us, and with the capacity to have cognizance of His own existence. You don't even need revelation to tell you that. But the Quran does make these points. The Quran says, do they not think within themselves? God has created not the heavens and the earth, and all that is between them, except with truth, and for an appointed term. And indeed, many of mankind deny the meeting with their Lord. And another verse in the Quran, indeed, in the creation of the heavens and the earth, and in the alternation of night and day, are signs for those of understanding. The word signs in Arabic is ayat. I'll come back to that in a second. Who remember God while standing or sitting or lying on their sides, and give thought to the creation of the heavens and the earth, saying, our Lord, you did not create this aimlessly, exalted are you above such a thing. And this is the meaning that comes to our lives. Because if you were intended to exist, and you were intended to live by a certain law, like everything in the universe follows regularities, then what is the law behind our existence? And then you have the basis to judge good and bad. Why? Because you know the intent. Obviously, we are very complex creatures, and we weren't born with instruction manuals. We require some help as to how to actually order mankind, which I would say is the argument for the necessity of revelation, because we're too complex. How are we meant to organize an economic system that produces real justice? How are we meant to organize a system that produces accountable government? True accountable government. How do we organize ourselves to create justice in the world, to give to those who need and those who deserve, and not to those who don't deserve? So these are things which political philosophers are still trying to wrangle to this day. We still don't know how to do these things. But, and very fascinatingly, if you know your purpose and you know how to live, you can judge good and bad. We know what a car is for. Generally speaking, a car is for transport, unless you buy one for demolition derby. But generally speaking, it's for transportation. So if a car's engine doesn't work and the car doesn't move, is it a good car or a bad car? Anyone? It's a bad car. Why is it a bad car?
Because it doesn't fulfill its purpose.
Exactly. Fulfilling your purpose is what determines good and bad. What other basis is there? I mean, even as Richard Dawkins said that, because he rejects this idea of obviously purpose behind the universe, he says that it doesn't exist. Good and bad doesn't really actually exist in reality. You could argue, as an atheist, he'd say it's a fiction that we produce. It doesn't actually good. There is no good, there is no bad. But because we have meaning, we have guidance, we can arguably from our perspective, that there is good and bad in the universe based on whether you fulfill your purpose. And the fascinating thing is that all aspect of human life. See, the thing is this: if God intended you to exist, and He made you to have a lifespan, and He made you to need to find food and to have family and to relate to other human beings, all these things you're going to do in your life, these were intended. Everything about that, what you do, is intended. Surely your purpose in life isn't just once a week. You know, people say, yeah, I go to church once a week, and that's my fulfillment. It's like, wait a second, is your purpose of life only once a week? Or is it part-time purpose of life? If you have a purpose of life, wouldn't it not affect every aspect inform every aspect of your life? Encompass every aspect of your life? And this is what the Quran says. It says, it tells the reader to say, verily, my prayers, my sacrifice, my living and my dying are for God, the Lord of all that exists, your entire life is encapsulated by your purpose. And this is spirituality. See, spirituality isn't that you float off as some disembodied spirit throughout the ether. That's not spirituality. Spirituality isn't just only going into some underneath a Bodhi tree and reflecting on things. I mean, yeah, it's good to reflect. No, nothing wrong with that. But that is not the be-all and end-all of spirituality, because we were created to eat. So while someone is reflecting off in there underneath a Bodhi tree or in a cave somewhere, there are people that have to actually till the land and produce fruits and vegetables so that humans can actually eat and feed the person who is focused on his particular matter or her matter. And here's the fascinating thing. If good and bad informs every action you do, and you are created to live in this life, then spirituality is everything that you do in your life. If you do it pursuing the good, fulfilling your purpose, having in mind your creator, that is spirituality. So being a good employee, that is spirituality. Being a good student, that is spirituality. Excelling in your field of study, that is spirituality. Being a good friend or good confidant to somebody, that is spirituality. Inventing a medicine that cures some forms of cancer, that is spirituality. As well as prayers, as well as reflection as well. All these aspects are spirituality. There is no division really between the material world and the spiritual world, because if you really want to reflect on it, as from our theist perspective, the entire universe was created by God or by the Creator. So the entire universe is spirituality, if you want to look at it from that perspective. Everything is spirituality. So this division that we've created, the artificial one, mainly in a secular world, that there's a material world and the spirituality is a fiction. There is no division, because everything is your purpose in life. And I know politics these days say we should keep, let's say, religion or ideology separate from politics, which they don't do it. Like, you tell a secular liberal to keep secular liberalism away from politics. They say, what? But it informs our politics. Well, so does our way of life does. So why are you telling us to do it as well? Or tell a communist, it's great you're a communist, but keep it for your private life, not for the political life. So wait a second, but communism is all about political, life and systems. Right? And the same with a Christian, same with a Jew as well. They had certain beliefs and ideas that informed their political life. So to say, and really what you're saying with the idea of secularism is, you're saying that whatever is your purpose in life, it should be separate from your life's affairs, which is completely irrational as a concept. So spirituality, brothers and sisters and friends, is not detached from the material world. As Muslims, we don't seek spirituality away from the material world. We seek spirituality through the material world, because ultimately all these things come from the same origin. We believe the Creator. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for that talk. It's a very interesting, fascinating talk. Now this is the time when we take questions and discussions. If you'd like, you can either just raise your hand and we'll pick up random questions from the audience, or you can SMS your question to the number on the screen, on the board over here if you want to be anonymous. And there will be first gentleman over there.
You spoke of spirituality in linkage with the good. My doubt is, could spirituality also be subject to a form of duality or neutrality? For instance, there's an electron, proton, and neutron, a positive, negative, and neutral. So, could spirituality?
There are also positrons, and okay, but all right.
There are some. I do agree. But so, could spirituality be of more forms than just the good that we see or the positive that we see? That's my first question.
Okay.
And the second thing, when you spoke of spirituality,
one at a time.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah.
One at a time. You want to ask him?
It's a short one.
Okay, go for it.
The second question that I have is, when you spoke of spirituality again, could you speak a bit more about the law of attraction and what you think?
Between positive and negative particles, or between humans?
Not between humans. Yeah, between humans is what we see. But then I'm thinking about law of attraction in the sense where you project your thoughts towards something that you need, and that automatically happens, which is pretty much like praying for something, and that comes your way.
Okay, I'll answer your points in reverse order. So, the law of attraction, well, I don't know if you call it a law, it's more of a, and this is just my opinion here, so no offense, I mean, and you're free to disagree with me. I don't believe that just because you covet something, it will happen to you. If that was the case, everybody would get what they want, because everyone covets. Right? So I don't think that is borne out by reality. But in response to your first point, is it possible to have a spirituality which is neutral or bad? Well, my point is this. If you are intended for something, so if a human being is intended to have some kind of, to do something, to achieve something within their capabilities, or to help achieve some daredevil tactics or something. It's all right. It's okay. Hope he doesn't come back in a red cape or something. He's quite anyway. So the issue of spirituality in neutral things or in, let's say, bad things, it wouldn't make any sense, because if you have an intent behind your existence and you don't fulfill that intent, then you're not doing an action for any higher reason or meaning. You're doing it with an intent within the material universe, purely for the intent within the material universe, which is not linked to good, to intention behind you. So then it wouldn't have any spiritual basis to that at all whatsoever. Then you could argue it's a material basis, as in your intent is purely, let's say, selfish, self-centered, or material, and not a higher value beyond the base material intent. So so let's say, for example, someone can give food to somebody else, and do so because they believe it to be a good thing to do according to their particular perspective and worldview. And that might be a spiritual action. But someone could also hate someone else, and maybe that person's rich that they don't like, and they kill that person to take their money or take their wealth. That is not doing it for a spiritual reason, a reason that's linked to their purpose in life. It's linked to something outside their purpose in life and would only reside in the material world. That's the action, the intent is only in the material world, not for anything higher. So in that sense, it's not spiritual and can't be spiritual. As for neutrality, I don't think there's anything really that you could argue is neutral and spiritual per se, because even if you're just driving your car, which you might say is a neutral action, it's always linked to something else. You're driving your car for what purpose? You're driving your car to university to study. You're driving your car to pick up your mum. You're driving your car just for relaxation, maybe, because you've had a stressful day. And of course, looking after yourself is something that you should do anyway. So anything you can do to de-stress yourself is a good thing, provided it's not drugs or anything like that, right? So it's always linked to something. So there's nothing that you can do that is not linked to spirituality, except bad things or things that are against your purpose, against the intent behind your existence. That'd be my answer to your question. Any other questions or contentions from the audience as well? So don't just give me questions, but if anyone actually disagrees with me, and I'm sure there's lots, or some, please make your points. That gentleman over there.
Yeah, I think your definition of secularism, secularism is about stopping the majority religion from imposing its own ideas of spirituality on everyone, and it's not about atheists imposing their ideas of spirituality.
So the gentleman, just to reiterate his question, he said that my definition of secularism is problematic because secularism is about not allowing a majority religion to impose its ideas on other people who might not share that religion, and it's not atheism. It's not secularism. Your last bit you said, yeah, secularism itself is not necessarily atheism, right? Okay. Well, first and foremost, whose definition of secularism? There are so many definitions of secularism. There's even a great book called Secularisms, which goes into this discussion of all different types of secularism. Some people interpret secularism as making government policy science-based, but not necessarily taking religion out of the question. Some people people generally think of Britain as a secular country, and yet the head of state is head of the church or leader of the church in some way, and you have like bishops in the House of Lords, which are not elected per se. Of course, even in America, where you don't have an established church, in this country you do have an established church. In America, you don't have an established church, but people who are, let's say, usually Protestant Christians will vote in mass numbers for policies which are informed by their religious belief. They just don't say they don't publicly say we do this law because the Bible says it. They just say we are pro-life, for example. They'll couch it in different terms. I would argue that secularism means different things to different people, and its first definition was disestablishment of church from state for the most part. or a state based on the leader just being whoever holds the weapons or the biggest stick is the leader, not the Pope or anything like that, who's just a spirit who doesn't have any weapons. Well, at least no weapons to control all the countries in Europe at the time. However, if you look at it secularism philosophically, what it actually means would be that, in theory, it would say, well, a religion informs morality. If you're saying that no religion should be the basis for any state, then what moral system will form the basis of any state? Now, usually the counter-argument from secular liberals is that, well, secular liberalism is, it's religion neutral, so that should be the right basis. But secular liberalism itself is a worldview, has a morality system, and it has a particular bias when it comes to judging right from wrong. So all you've done is substitute one religion for a materialistic religion, quote unquote. This time being secular liberalism. Communism too has a worldview. It has a basis of judging right from wrong. And no one would say that communism was neutral when it came to different religious beliefs. And so I think the same shouldn't be said of secular liberalism. You just get different types of secular liberalism. So there are some which are really imposed strongly on society, like in France, where you sisters wearing hijab would not be allowed to wear hijab in good old secular France. You can't pray in public in France, and you certainly can't wear the face covering in France too. It's a good old free France. Whereas in England, which still actually has an established church, the Church of England has been actually very pluralistic to many religions, and actually some people argue that England is much more accepting of different religions because it has an established church, which was ecumenical and accepting, not pure secular state like France. And of course, the French Revolution wasn't all roses and rainbows and gumdrop smiles. So that's the little discussion on secularism. So I would argue that secularism doesn't mean any one particular thing. And if you look at it philosophically, it argues an absurd notion, which is your purpose in life is separate from your life's affairs. And purpose in life informs morality, right? Now, all that really happens is all the politicians adopt any particular morality they follow of their belief system and argue for it via non-religious language, but they do it back in America. In England, secular liberalism has become like a mainstream ideology, and so people will argue, even Christians will argue, that it's acceptable for euthanasia and abortions and so on and so forth because they've adopted secular liberalism in their public life, even though privately they disagree with it, which I think is a bit hypocritical on them. But some of them are forced to be hypocritical because if they would outwardly express their religious opinions, they would be cast down strongly by a secular media. But I digress. Anyway, so I argue that the secularism itself doesn't make sense philosophically. Every society orders its laws by morality. Laws come from morality, and morality comes from your worldview. There's no way of getting rid of that.
Sorry, just before we take a text and SMS question.
Sure.
Onto the floor. The question is, would that definition of spirituality be in line with the Islamic definition of Sufism? And follow up with that, it says, and how does the Islamic definition of spirituality differ from other faith traditions?
Okay, interesting question. So, how would the definition I presented differ from Tasawwuf?
And it said, it also mentioned things like Buddhism.
Okay, I'll deal with the first part of the question. So Tasawwuf is, okay, it's a spiritual discipline. I think the early forms of what is called Sufism are really just psychotherapy for Muslims. Ultimately, what do you do in psychotherapy? When you go to a psychotherapist, you have a particular problem with your subconscious. You have a particular habit or behavior that you have an issue with. And the psychotherapist tries to help you to deal with it. It might be anxiety, it might be depression, it might be you have anger problems. So the psychotherapist tries to put you in some kind of a course, be either cognitive behavioral therapy or some other kind. It shouldn't be drugs, but that's psychiatry, not psychotherapy. They just say, well, here's some drugs for your anxiety. But it should be, it should actually be to deal with your problem that you have in your heart, so to speak. So if you look at Tasawwuf, as it was, which is the Arabic word, I suppose, for the practice that Muslims have been kind of engaged in for centuries, it's really a type of Islamic psychotherapy to get your heart in line with the Islamic model for conduct behavior. So if you're anxious, a person who's adept at practicing Tasawwuf might put you in some certain types of realizations or certain types of reflections, certain types of practices to help you reflect that, for example, maybe your life is in the hands of God and whatever happens to you, you should trust in it, but just do your best and not worry about things you don't control to help you get rid of your anxiety, maybe. Right? So Tasawwuf really is just Islamic psychotherapy, and It's not really a particular sect or different school of thought. It's actually just a practice. After or during the time of, and maybe even prior to the time of colonialism in the Muslim world, and you had a lot of these Western ideas come in, certain Muslims started to interpret tasawwuf as a requirement to just separate from the material world and go into the spiritual world of just separate from material society, or material society is bad or evil, mainly because Muslims were losing control over the material world, so to speak. So obviously the Europeans had superior military technology and so on and so forth, and Muslims couldn't compete around about the 18th and 19th centuries, and they started to kind of divorce themselves from the world. And this is actually very recent in Muslim history. Just to give you an interesting example, people think that of Sufis as being pacifists and so on, which is not traditionally what they were. Some of the great Sufi practitioners were actually military leaders and commanders. They even led insurrections against French occupation of Algeria, against Italian occupation of Libya, and so on and so forth. These were Sufi commanders and generals who fought, and Russian occupation of Chechnya as well in the 19th century. So these were Sufi commanders and generals who were very much in the world. And if you looked at Sufi practitioners, or tasawwuf practitioners rather, at night, yes, they were engaged in acts of reflection and pondering and worship. However, in the daytime, they were judges, commanders, leaders, politicians, so on, scientists, whatever. So this separation of the material world and spiritual world doesn't exist, but rather because the human heart requires some modification over time, because it might have accrued wrong habits, bad perceptions, it needs to be worked on, and this is what tasawwuf comes into it. So that will be mounted to that. The second point of how does Islamic spirituality differ from Buddhism, Christianity, and others, I would say that, in these traditions, there's a lot of variance of practice. So you might have Christians who are very much, their practice of spirituality is almost identical to, let's say, or similar to Muslim practice. There have been cases where people will go into monasteries and they'll have communes of monks or nuns who want to be separate from the world of politics and the world of the more mundane world and just focus on their rituals. And there have been equivalents happening in the Muslim world too, with men going into the Muslim equivalent of monasteries and separating from the material world to do meditation. But that we call asceticism, but asceticism isn't really an early Islamic recommendational practice, because the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he lived in the real world. He didn't go into a monastery or just spend his entire life separate. I mean, sure, he spent a lot of time pondering about things prior to his prophethood, when he was trying to work out the purpose of life, and he was trying to work out these things, and then we believe he received revelation at that point. But after he received revelation, he very much went out into the world. He was a political leader, he was a judge, he was very much someone who was a teacher, and he was a father, and he was a husband. He did all these different things, which is in the real world, or in the material world, so to speak. So asceticism isn't really an Islamic practice, but certainly, and religions that engage with asceticism, or they have ascetic practices, is probably just a human phenomenon, not necessarily a religious phenomenon. As for Buddhism, I think that obviously we don't believe that if someone who's trying to be engage in spirituality should, for example, abstain themselves from marriage, and likewise with those who are Muslims who are trying to attain knowledge in Islam. We don't have a clergy anyway. We don't believe that they should abstain from marriage, because marriage, we have reproductive organs, so it is intended for us to generally get married, we believe, or at least for those who can. But there are people who choose that path individually because they find it most gratifying for themselves. And early Christianity did not necessarily encourage asceticism, but it became that way over time. It's a human phenomenon that just pops up in every human culture, but as Muslims, we don't believe that humans, to become more spiritual, you have to divorce yourself from the material world of which you were made into. You were born into the material world. So why do you think you should be separate from it during your life? You should actually be engaging with it until your life ends, and then that's your separation from the material world.
There was a gentleman over there who had his hand up for you.
Firstly, I really like a definition of spirituality. I think it's a very healthy way to carry forward the idea if you know how to fulfill your life. Aside from that, I have a number of contentions with some of the things you said. How much?
If you take a limited number.
Yeah, how much?
Okay, I tell you what. Put two forward, and then we'll open up. And then if no one else has any more points, we'll come back to, just to give time for others. But put two of your most contentious contentions.
Well, I would go for the, I think, more obvious one, but less problematic one. But I think you're slightly unfair on the idea of materialism, to argue that materialism entails no sort of meaning or no sort of understanding. Like, for example, when you draw the parallel with the book, you say you read the book, but that's just a material thing, and that's somehow evidence that there is something immaterial and spiritual to the universe, which isn't really true. Materialism doesn't struggle to account for information transformation or transference.
Okay. I mean, you don't have to be a theist to read a book. I mean, that's not what I was arguing. I was really arguing that in the eyes of the universe or the material world, language itself is not a material thing. It's not something that's a tangible object in of itself.
Well, not as a discrete single language, but every single phenomena of language, including spoken and interpretation, is explicable from a materialistic sense.
Well, here's the thing. It's explicable from materialistic. Well, here's the issue. I mean,
it's not an issue. It doesn't prove.
Okay. Well, I don't think you could say it's explicable from a materialist sense. I would like to hear the explanation as to what is a consciousness, what is information or knowledge.
What is myself?
Yeah. Well, okay. What is? Okay. I mean, just to give a point. So I've listened to the materialist explanations of consciousness. So they say that all these biochemical processes that happen in your brain create an electric field of some kind. This field is consciousness. In essence, it's the materialist version of the soul. Is this, again, a non-tangible field that is bioelectrical field? I know, that's one theory from...
Neuroscience isn't intangible. The electrical impulses are very well documented and quite well understood. That doesn't mean we can relate every impulse to every psychological phenomenon, but it's not a mystery as to what is happening.
Well, look, consciousness, right? Please tell me where they find it under a CAT scan or a magnetic resonance imaging machine. Please tell me where they find consciousness. Currently, the best theory they can produce is that consciousness arises out of these chemical processes happening in your brain. It arises as some kind of disembodied electrical field, which is pretty much the materialist version of the soul. But it's a speculation. What does a feeling feel like, right? So people, there's a common joke. People say that, love is no different to eating large amounts of chocolate. Maybe for some people it is, hey. But what it actually feels like, the perception, the experience, or the understanding of knowledge itself, what is that, where do you find knowledge? I mean, sure, you can see neurons connecting each other to when you're trying to remember things. Yeah, of course. But how do you know that's connected to someone remembering it? It's because the person tells you, right now I'm remembering something. Oh, okay, and then you link it, what they've just told you, what they claim, maybe they could be lying, but we generally think they're not going to be lying for a scientific experiment, but we're relying on someone's testimony as part of our scientific experiment, and that's my point. It's not material.
When you describe it as the scientific equivalent of a soul, that's quite misleading, because the soul...
No, the materialist equivalent of a soul.
The materialist equivalent of a soul. One asserts there is a soul, and therefore we have this abstract object that we can't really prove or observe or anything like this. Whereas from a scientific perspective, you're consistently linking it to observations, and you create theories that fall down if you can't find the evidence to substantiate them, or if you find evidence that directly contradicts them. So the idea of how neurons work, if we suddenly find consciousness arising in trees, in a discernible way, our theory of consciousness will completely change. What soul does.
Well, the question is, how would you know that trees are even conscious? If you have to rely on them to tell it to you, much like you have to rely on the person if you're CAT scanning or MRIing an individual and they tell you, right now I'm remembering something nice, and then you measure what's happening in their mind and you link it to what they've said on their testimony. But you don't, okay, my point is...
That's not relevant.
But my point is this, and I try to tell people so that they don't get confused with scientific jargon. What's really happening when the scientists are saying that we know how memory works, because we know that if someone's remembering something, neurons will be forming new connections. We know this because someone in an experiment said, right now I'm remembering something, and they would tell the subject, please remember something at this point in time while we scan your brain. And then they say, well, because we told him to do this, and we see that this thing is happening in his brain at the same time, these two things must be connected. That's what they do in a scientific experiment. But they can't see knowledge. But they can't see knowledge in an MRI. They can't see consciousness in an MRI. And really, all the discussions of what is consciousness are speculations, not based on any evidence, including free will.
They're not non-evidence based. They are based on explaining the evidence for yourself.
Okay. Do you know what speculation is?
Speculation is just thinking about it. It's literally a thought.
Not necessarily. If I see the sun come up and it looks round, and I say the sun is a disc, right? The sun must be a disc. And I say, why do you say that, Abdullah? Well, it's based on the evidence that the sun is round. So I've used an observation, I've taken an observation, and I now make a speculation based on observation to explain the observation, right? What you described is quite literally no different.
No, it's not.
All right? No. It's not.
When you look at the sun,
It's always. Let me finish. We all observe different things in this universe. Where we all differ is how we explain them, the theories, and scientists differ as to how they explain things, right? So, is for example, is light a particle or photon, or is it a wave? What is the exact nature of the electron? Because we see superposition exhibited by the electron, and now we think, what is it now? It's very confusing. So we come up with theories to explain things that we see, but let's not confuse the theory for something that's proven. Okay, and that's the point. Most theories, when they first are formulated, are speculations as to. Let me bring an explanation that explains that situation. Yeah?
Theories that persist in science are theories that you create a hypothesis to then test your theory, and then you make observations that work.
The theories that persist in science are theories that are not falsified. But the problem is that there are theories how can we falsify them, right? So, for example, let's say someone says that inside a black hole there is infinite density, right? Speculation. We don't know.
I mean, that's not based on speculation. That's based on specific readings. I mean, I don't know what's inside.
And exactly. Or
I think it's based on particular readings, particular electromagnetic,
No. It's they take. They take limited observation of the universe. It's the equivalent of me saying, there's this famous, classical Islamic discourse on the matter. You put people into a room, and you put an elephant in the room, and the lights are all turned off, and everyone grabs a different part of the elephant, and they start describing what's there. So, it's a tree in this room, and someone says it's a rope because they're feeling the trouble. The rope. Trouble wouldn't necessarily feel like a rope, but anyway, right? So, based on their limited observation, they're coming up with theories as to what is actually in the room. But only if someone who turned the light on and could see the entire thing from all angles would know truly what it is. So, considering, and here's my point, is that science is just observation, and considering that we don't have omnipresence nor omniscience, so we can't see the entire universe as it is from every angle. We are making speculations on limited observations of the universe. Now, I don't think it's a bad thing because it helps us to gradually refine our ideas, and it's really great. But the problem the issue I take is when you have ideologically motivated, let's say, scientists, many of them are atheists, who like to make big jumps. And because they are scientists, they present their speculation as theory. So when Sam Harris talks about consciousness, and he says that, it's explainable. It isn't explainable. It quite literally is not explainable. But what he's doing is, it's explainable with, I could produce a theory for it from my own biases about the subject. Well, fine. Anyone can do that, all right? Anyone can do that. But look, all you need to do to refute me on this matter, and which I'll accept, is please present me an MRI scan of consciousness, and I will concede the point.
I mean, this is the issue. You're asking for consciousness to be represented in a way that we don't understand consciousness. It's like the whole energy thing. Again.
Well,
it's not a container.
Any evidence for consciousness beyond testimony? Any evidence for it beyond testimony?
As a neuroscientist, I can speak. I don't know, not on behalf of the full field. We don't have a theory for consciousness.
We have theories for
Sorry, just one second. What do you study at university? Just curiosity.
This is irrelevant.
Okay. Look. The reason why I ask is if you're making sweeping statements about fields of study at the university, and if someone who said that they studied at university makes a point, as Sister has said about neuroscience. Now, obviously, you guys haven't studied the latest discussions on neuroscience, or most of you, unless you're all neuroscience students, maybe you are. But assuming that you don't just all study neuroscience, many people here won't know what is the current discussion of neuroscience here. So I'm saying that, ignore me, ignore him, and listen to the sister who claims she's obviously studying neuroscience.
Huh? From authority, this is the exact point I was making.
Tell me, you believe in the theory... Let me make it, you believe in the theory of relativity, right?
I have a vague understanding of what it is, and it seems more likely to be true than not to be.
Okay, have you performed the experiments that demonstrate relativity? So where did you learn about it from?
Well, I mean, I don't know much about it.
Where did you learn about it from, though?
Well, I don't know much about it, so my lecturers at some point.
So someone from authority then told it to you and you believed it?
There's a difference between taking...
Okay, all right, I get the
There's
point.
a difference between deference to expertise and an argument from authority. An argument from authority is, I'm an expert in this area, therefore what I say is true. Whereas deferring to somebody's expertise is saying, these are a group of people and there are less explicable reasons as to why they would lie or be wrong than as...
That's a variation argument from authority, still.
It's not really.
That's my point. Most of the people who believe in different scientific theories will only know about it from books and from individuals that teach them. Yeah, sure, the vast majority might not have any basis for lying, but if you didn't directly yourself perform the scientific experiment, you cannot argue that you base all your knowledge purely on observation, and that was my point. But that being said, and I don't want to derail this discussion, we can have a great discussion as to whether language or whether knowledge or consciousness is material or not, but it doesn't detract from the main point of my presentation, which is that the only possibility that exists for the origin of everything that is finite and limited is an unlimited, infinite creator that willed it to come into existence. That was my main argument. But your second question, okay.
We move on to another question. We'll come back.
Did other people actually ask questions as well?
It's okay. Sorry. Please, I don't appreciate that. I will. Sorry.
Yeah.
People in the audience, I don't appreciate making comments to other people in the audience. I will make comments to everybody.
I tell you what. Okay. I tell you what. So we'll open up to everybody else to have a chance, and if that's exhausted, we'll come back to you again. Just to give everyone else to have a chance. So you. Is there someone else? Yeah.
Assalamu alaikum, jazakallah khair for the lecture. I have one main question, which is we believe that human was created for a purpose, and we also believe in Islam that there is a decree, there is a qada wal qadar. Then the famous argument, which I don't have a very, very clear answer about, is that so humankind was given a free will.
Yeah.
Either when you go to a right path, you go to Jannah, or you go to another path, you go to Jahannam. So how does... Sorry? Okay. Heaven and hell. Either go to heaven or hell. So now I wanted to say, how does Islam treat both the free will given to human as well as the decree?
Okay, so a typical time-old discussion between philosophers on the matter. So I'll answer it very simply. So that might be a bit bold to say that actually. No, I'll answer generally kind of plainly, which is everything that exists, we believe, is created by the Creator, and because it didn't create itself, it would have to be always maintained by the Creator. Because if we didn't control our own existence, how can we maintain our existence? I mean, you don't have control over living forever, for example, and so there will be outside processes, which hopefully not for a long time yet, but which will eventually, or internal processes, which will cease to function, and that will be the end of your duration. So the universe itself didn't come into existence by itself, didn't create itself, and likewise, we believe is maintained always by the same Creator that created it in the first place. So everything that happens is maintained and intended by God. So that how does that fit with the idea that we have free will? Well, it's very simply, I would say that God quite literally facilitates our free will. It's like, I use this analogy, but it's just an analogy. It doesn't actually fit it well, but if any of you play a computer game or just anything on the computer, you'll see that the electricity and the processor of the computer facilitates the actions which are happening in the computer, even if you're inside a virtual world. But all the events which happen are facilitated by the processor, and the processor accepting your request to move something here with your mouse or your keyboard. And obviously, the processor has to accept that request for you to be allowed to do whatever you want to do. Right? But it's not a perfect analogy because obviously the computer doesn't control your choice. However, if you imagine that we are all kind of almost like computer sprites in the program, in the matrix, then everything is facilitated by, let's just say, a processor, using my analogy. Anyway, I'll throw that analogy away for now. So in terms of the issue of the creator of the universe, everything that happens is by his will and can only happen by his permission. Now, we believe that God's knowledge is not limited or finite, as in God is not finite, limited, full stop. So he knows exactly what decision you would make in any situation, and what decision and how you would act in any situation. So in any situation you're in, he brings about your choice. And so the choice is yours. But because he's not limited, He doesn't have to wait to see, okay, well, what this person would do, I don't know what this person would do, so I'll see what they do. That would mean that God is limited. But if God is unlimited, then he knows exactly what you would freely choose, and he facilitates you to make that choice. So the choice is still yours, but you depend on God to bring it about, because ultimately your whole existence depends on God. Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes sense, but like there's one major part, right?
Sure.
For example, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, yeah, I'm going to say in English.
Okay, it's okay.
When he says you don't choose who you're going to guide on, or that particular sense. So basically, you're free to choose which path to take, but at the same time, it has been decreed if you get what I'm trying to say.
Okay, well, let me give you a verse from English Proverbs, which is, you can take a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. Right? So the verse of the Quran is saying that you can't choose. You don't choose who is guided, basically, because you don't have any control over someone else's free will. And likewise, if someone is to be guided, it's on their own merits. So are they really sincere to the truth or not? There's a verse which says just to paraphrase the verse, it says that God misguides those who are unjust, basically. So someone who's unjust and does bad things and is not basically a sincere person, God misguides them, right? So he basically, what it means is he keeps them away from the truth because, or rather, they would because they're an unjust, insincere person, and they've made those kind of choices, they will not be guided, basically. They will not be given and shown the pathway to the truth and so on, because they've been an unjust and they wouldn't accept it anyway, right? So this is basically the case. So you're all you're all responsible for your choices, but you don't control everything in the universe. And your choices, for them to even be made, it requires God's permission for God to bring them out of you, because you didn't make yourself, and you certainly can't make anything. So we require God to facilitate us to have that permission to do so. So in a way, God is a facilitator of your free will. So while God will not compel you to be bad or to be good, but rather God will facilitate your choice and will, support your ability to make that choice, basically, of which you wouldn't have that ability to do so. Okay.
I just want to know, I understand what you said about how that the universe was created, and I understand the theory is kind of how the universe was created, that there must have been created. My question is, why was creation created in the first place?
So why was creation created in the first place?
Why were we all created?
Okay, well, this is an interesting question, and I suppose I alluded to it, but we were created. I mean, the Quran says that I have not created mankind or jinn except to worship me. God is saying in the Quran. So we are here to worship Him. But what does that mean? What does worship mean? And the only definition you can really understand by worship, which is used in Arabic, the word worship, na'bud, means basically to follow, to make God the intent of our actions. And I think it's clear, it's borne out by reality itself. Everything in this universe, as I said, follows a law. And my point was, what is our law? And so I can make God the intent of my actions, but what does that look like? So I want to do something for God, but what does God want me to do for Him? So God wants me to feed the poor. God wants me to help those in need. God wants me to stand up for justice. And that's how I do actions. And I do those actions intending it for God. And that's where the spirituality comes into it.
Well, why would God want to create us in the first place?
Well, see, no, but see, here's the thing, right? You see, this is actually us anthropomorphizing God unintentionally. But it's a good question to ask. But I'm saying that people are stuck with that because we unintentionally make an assumption. And so, don't worry, humans make unintentional assumptions all the time. It's nothing wrong, per se, as long as we realize them, right? The unintentional assumption is that God does things because He needs things. Right? So, but God doesn't need food or sustenance. The Quran says that. The Quran says that it doesn't even hurt God in the slightest if mankind was to turn away from Him. It wouldn't hurt God in the slightest. We do it in essence, what we're doing actually benefits our own selves, not Him. He's not benefited by it. But if you want to ask why would God do something, He does things because that's His will. Because He's the first cause. You're asking me what would cause the first cause to do something. But that posits that there's something before Him, or that motivates Him, like He has instincts, like animals do, or He feels lonely, or He feels, or He wants a companionship, or He wants food, or He feels hunger. These things, an infinite, unlimited thing, what Creator wouldn't need these things at all whatsoever. So when God wills things, and rationally we conclude that's the only possibility anyway. We can rationally conclude that's the only possibility. That he wills things purely out of his own volition, purely because he initiates it. But, and he wills things in a particular measure. So he says, God says in the Quran, he measured things out in truth, that things are to achieve a certain objective in this reality. So things are to achieve a certain intent. But as to what motivates God to do these things is a meaningless question, considering that if he's the first cause, there's nothing prior to the first cause. You see? Whereas we as creatures depend on other motivating factors to push us, like instincts, like desires, like feelings. We require those things to push us to do stuff. But God is not in requirement of anything and doesn't have any instincts that push him. So that's what it's like saying, can I imagine infinity? I can't imagine it. Can I imagine an absolute first cause? I can't fully imagine it. But rationally I can comprehend it, but I can't imagine it or really encapsulate it because I'm a finite creature. I don't know what infinity, can't count it, doesn't know what it looks like. I can't understand what an infinite or unlimited thing would look like because I'm a finite, limited creature. It's like going to a calculator and doing 1 divided by 0. I don't care how powerful your calculator is. Right? Your calculator every calculator will show error. It can't do that calculation. But there's no conviction in the concept. God can just will things because he wills things. But he's not human like us to require prerequisite, if that's what you're asking for. So the intent behind the universe is only the intent that he told us for, which is that we make him the intent of our actions. And everything in this universe obeys God's law anyhow. So, the Quran says, will you choose a religion other than God's when everything in this universe submits to him? You see. So, the lady in the front.
I have Jazakallah khair. I have 2 questions.
Okay, she said thank you. Okay.
I have 2 questions. Is that okay?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. First question. There's a verse in the Quran, I don't really know it word for word, but it says something along the lines of, those whose hearts are closed up, they'll never seek a way to God. And I often get confused by that, isn't Islam meant to be fair? Everyone isn't don't people have free will? Is it really true that God closes certain hearts up? And and if it's true, how can that be explained alongside free will? And also my other question is, there are some people who argue that nowadays the word kafir is a slur because it's been used to persecute religious minorities in the Middle East, like Christians and Arab Jews as well, basically Muslim extremists, and also in the past when they'd be persecuted, that word is basically used as well as a device towards them. So there are many Arab Christians who kind of don't like the word because of the history, the violent history of it from their part, and so they say therefore this word should be avoided. But at the same time, it's mentioned in the Quran. So from a Muslim perspective, how can we deal with that?
Okay. So I'll answer the first question first, and then I'm going to give you a second one. So the first one is, there are descriptions in the Quran that refer to people's hearts being closed. In other cases, it refers to people who believe little. And it refers to people who've made the assumption, and it is an assumption, that God couldn't possibly exist. And that there's only material explanations for the universe. Not looking at anybody. No, okay. But no, we don't know. I mean, even atheists, or people who are accused of being atheists, actually could be a type of agnostic. So it's not always the case. But people who can make assumptions, and if they make that assumption, why do they make that assumption? There could be a whole host of psychological reasons. Not that they're insane, but just that they find the idea of being accountable a great big burden. Especially in secular liberal societies where the belief of the autonomy of the individual, or the sovereignty of the individual, doesn't tolerate that there is anything else beyond the individual that should compel the individual to do stuff, basically. Right? So the idea of God, which God then becomes viewed as a unwanted interloper, like he's interfering in your life. So basically, you just somehow made yourself, and God's just interfering with you, and that's why we shouldn't believe in him. I mean, that it's irrational as a concept. The secular liberal philosophical premise of the absoluteness of the individual, which doesn't even bear evidence in the actual observation of humans. Humans aren't actually we might exist as separate units, but we're not individual in the full sense. I mean, if no one taught you language, you'd never learn it. Basically, you have to thank other human beings for teaching you language, of which you used to think. Basically, most of your characteristics were imparted to you by your parents and society, which is why most people are very conformist to their society. They say, I'm going to be an individual, do my own thing, and they buy the same clothes that everybody else buys. And they say, but I'm an individual, I do my own things, I'm not conformist. And yet like for example, if the Goths who say, we're non-conformists, and yet they all conform to their own fashion as a minority group. So humans, in one aspect they influence each other quite a lot. In fact, one could argue, what is it about the individual that actually makes it unique, or not unique, but authentic in of themselves? An individual could be, you could say your genes, your society, your parents determined your personality. What else is left? Nothing else. Right. So that's a different discussion anyway. But in terms of when the Quran describes people who close up their hearts, it's a person that makes that assumption for some reason that might motivate them. They don't like accountability. They don't. They have been taught at a young age that it's a fairy story, or it's fanciful, or it's regressive, or that religion is somehow backward for humanity, or what have you. They've taught something in their mind. Maybe they don't like a father figure. Maybe they had a problem with their parents. There's a whole number of possibilities. I'm not saying that's the only possibility. There's a thousand possibilities, which someone will say, I don't like the idea of God's existence, and I will reject a priori that any possibility. And there's an interesting verse in the Quran which said that, if a person who has chosen to disbelieve was to see a miracle, they would try to explain it like, oh, I'm suffering a delusion, or it's a hallucination I'm experiencing. And the Quran said, little is it that they believe, as in that they don't, because they've rejected the possibility of something beyond the material world, or the small little bubble of the tangible world they're in. They've already rejected there's no evidence, there's literally no evidence you could give them. In fact, here's an interesting test. What evidence would be sufficiently required for them to believe in God? If they saw a chariot coming down from the sky with a Zeus-like figure on it, they could explain that as either they're hallucinating, they've taken too much LSD, or possibly aliens. Whatever. There's always some explanation they can bring to say, no, there's still a materialistic explanation. So it's literally non-falsifiable if you've made that assumption. So they've closed their hearts, and there's no guidance that they're going to. But they made the choice to close their hearts on that matter. And so then what the Quran says, that's the case, then God is not going to guide them. What it means is that they will not even experience any discomfort or cognitive dissonance by being shown the truth anymore. Let them live their life out in their ignorance because they've chosen it. Even peacefully. It's actually a mercy of God that if they've chosen to reject Him, at least in life, they're going to have a kind of peaceful life separate from the truth because they've already rejected it. And they say, all right, fine. All right, don't trouble yourself anymore in this life. Enjoy your life, for your limited duration. Right? And that's a bit of mercy, in a way that, okay, if they rejected the truth, they get this life of relative peace, such that it is anyway. So we see this is what the Quran is talking about. It doesn't mean that they are now compelled to disbelieve. Right? It's always those who are unjust, those who are insincere, those who've chosen to close their hearts. They're the ones who are misguided because they've chosen to misguide themselves. And really what God is doing is, all right, fine, then at least have a life, quote-unquote, happy as it can be in your misguidance for that duration. As for your second point, the use of the word kafir. So I've actually faced, certainly even from the media, when I've used the word kafir, to say, oh, you're insulting non-Muslims. And I say, well, in the Quran, one word is used, and it can mean, in different places, and it can mean different things depending on the context of its use. So
specifically mean like just any non-Muslim, or like specifically religious minorities in the West? Sure,
no, I'll get to that. Yeah, I'll get to that. So, theologically speaking, a kafir theologically is someone who rejects the truth while knowing it, or does not even bother to investigate it because they're happy to live an ignorant life. And they've chosen not to even research or check what they've been told, or they've chosen to reject the truth once they know it, full stop. So an insincere, a deliberately ignorant person, someone who's deliberately chosen ignorance. Now, the thing is this, how do we know who truly fits that bill? Because the Quran describes a type of kafir called a munafiq. So a munafiq says they're Muslim. A munafiq will say they're Muslim, they're born in a Muslim family. But being a Muslim was purely incidental. They're born in a Muslim family, what am I? Mom and dad? Oh, I'm a Muslim. Okay, that's my culture, that's my society, I'll just conform to my society. But they're still just as deliberately ignorant. And when they are really tested with truth, of doing the right thing or doing something which is not beneficial for them individually, they will pick the selfish motive as opposed to the truthful motive. And that's their test, you understand, in this life. So ultimately, God alone truly knows who the real followers submitters to Him are. and who are the real rejectors. Because there are people in the Day of Judgment who come to God and say, God, if I had known the truth, I would have followed it. Right? And they might be tested on the Day of Judgment, or they might be tested only on what good they knew, what little limited knowledge they did know. They'll be tested on, did you follow what you did know was right and wrong? Did you follow your conscience and what you did know? It could be a guy from the Amazon rainforest who never encountered religion at all, a whole number of things, right? So ultimately, God is not unjust. So just because you say you're Muslim doesn't mean that you are necessarily saved, because did you really pick your religion? Will you really follow the truth? All right? The second point is, if anyone can, there are people who will come in their judgment not saying they were Muslim in this life, and sincerely telling to God, if I knew the truth, really I would have followed it. So they're not really kafir. So ultimately, God truly knows who the real kafir is and who the real follower or sincere or mukhlis person, the person who has its sincerity in their hearts. As for the other uses of the word kafir in the Quran, it's not necessarily derogatory, but it is, for example, just to explain that we believe that prophets came to every nation. We believe that in many nations the truth was corrupted. So the people, at some point, their ancestors might have rejected the truth. They did kufr. Kufr means to reject. It just means to literally literally it means to cover. Actually, in Arabic, it means just to cover something up. So a person might be from the people whose ancestors rejected the truth, but that particular person might be a sincere person and not a true kafir. But sometimes the Quran uses it in a legal sense to mean someone from a people whose ancestors rejected the truth at some point. But it doesn't mean that on the Day of Judgment that particular person is actually a rejecter of the truth. And this is clear in Arabic language, but if you make a direct translation, people assume it's a pejorative term in all its uses. And sometimes it literally just means a non-Muslim. But a non-Muslim could end up on the Day of Judgment being saved, whereas a person who called himself a Muslim, on the Day of Judgment ended up being punished because they weren't sincere. And yet the person who was not a Muslim was sincere during their life. So that's why we have the word munafiq in Arabic. It also mentioned in the Quran. A person who says, yeah, I'm Muslim, but in their heart they're just a kafir who was born in a Muslim society, if that makes any sense. And there are people who are mukhlis, we have an Arabic word for them, they're called the hunafa or hanif. Right? Someone who's not a Muslim, who says they're not a Muslim, doesn't say they're Muslim, doesn't obviously pray or do any of those things. But on the Day of Judgment, because they were sincere to the truth, whatever they could find in their society, their culture, whatever, they are saved, the Hanif. So I hope that explains the kind of intricacies. So kafir is not necessarily a pejorative term, but theologically speaking, all Muslims would admit that only God truly knows who truly is the kafir and who truly is the mukhlis, the sincere person or the believer, because you can't see into people's hearts. Right? So that's the top to bottom of, as you say, Islamic salvation or soteriology. I hope that answers your question.
I have a question out there as well.
Yeah, do so.
You seem very quick to dismiss the scientific arguments because of what happened with things like which I don't have to test that, but something like, why you don't apply that to say Islam with the same problems of theodicy or the problems of internal contradiction within the Quran, like historical narrative being a bit sketchy. So why do you not apply the same logic to that as you did with the scientific arguments? You did find it.
Okay, so the gentleman says that I was very quick to dismiss scientific theories, but why don't I apply the same rigor to Islam? And your claimed points that there was contradictions in the Quran, historical, I don't know, was it inconsistencies or lack of evidence, and the problem of theodicy? Well, here's where I would find the contention. Firstly, I don't reject science. I'm actually am a great advocate for Muslims to engage in science, and I'm extremely happy to hear that, for example, sisters are neuroscientists, and some are engineers, and some are physicists, and there's more Muslims coming into science now in Muslim world, and are beginning to aim for Nobel Prizes. Not that we need Nobel Prizes, but my point is that Muslims are rediscovering a Islamic tradition of investigating natural world that God told us to. So God says, do you not see how the mountains were created, how the heavens were raised up, how the camels are? I mean, the Quran is full of exhortations to observe the natural world and see how these things work in the natural world. Verse after verse after verse. That's why it spurs Islamic thinking on the matter. So I'm all for science. I just don't like when ideologically motivated scientists try to fit in some of their materialistic assumptions about the cosmos into science when there's no evidence. Like the multiverse, there's as much evidence for the multiverse as Zeus and Thor. And yet, some people call it a scientific theory. There are scientists who very rightly have denounced that and saying that is not science. That's not scientific theory. It is purely a speculation by someone. So I'm all for science. I'm all for observational natural world. I'm just against speculation that is motivated by a consistent desire to deny any other possibilities. And I'll give you just one small example before I answer your point in force, which is there was Einstein believed in the steady-state theory. I bring this example up every time. So the steady-state theory. Steady-state theory is the belief that the universe is eternal, that it has always existed in roughly the way it has existed. Steady-state theory. And so much did he want to believe that, he even invented these universal constant numbers to kind of make the equations work on his theory of steady-state theory. Along came a Belgian priest, who was also a physicist, Georges Lemaitre, who said that basically the universe expanded from a common origin point and it began to exist in essence. And Einstein famously said that I can't fault your mathematics, but I hate your conclusion. Right? With telescopes and getting better and satellites and so on, so obviously we now see much more clearly the redshift and other evidences to show that the universe is expanding. Every galaxy is moving away from us, every single one. So therefore, the universe is expanding. It must have a common origin point. Now everyone accepts the idea of the Big Bang. You know, the Big Bang, that actual line, the Big Bang theory, was actually a pejorative word invented by an atheist scientist to say, what is this theory these people are coming up with, Big Bang? It was actually meant to be a pejorative, but it stuck. It's now, everyone calls it the Big Bang theory. So the Big Bang theory is not just a comedy series and so on. It's actually, it was originally a pejorative used by atheists against those who believed that the universe had a start point, a beginning point. So there you see how, in that particular case, evidence defeated an atheist who made a materialist assumption of the eternality of the universe, which rationally wouldn't make sense anyway. So rationality would predict that that wouldn't make sense and wasn't true. And then the evidence came along to refute that theory, and the Big Bang theory is now mostly accepted by most scientists. Back then, the majority of scientists accepted the steady-state theory. Right? So just because the majority of scientists believe something doesn't mean it's true per se. And for the vast majority of human history, the vast majority of scientists, in fact almost all scientists up until the modern age, even up until maybe the 18th century, if not later, were God-believing scientists. Catholics, Jews, Muslims. The first universities, scientific universities in the West were built by, universities anyway, were built by the Catholic Church. Right? They weren't against scientific development, but I digress. As to your points that you mentioned regarding the issue of theodicy, the issue of you saying the issues of historicity of the Quran, and the issues of internal contradictions, we can have a different discussion on this, but I challenge each and every one of those claims as being false. We have very good historicity of the Quran. Just even recently, there was the Mingana manuscripts discovered in a collection in Birmingham. Not that they were unearthed in Birmingham, where they carbon dated them to basically within the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Yeah, right. I recently debated Tom Holland on this, not necessarily on that particular issue, but he's the guy who likes to say, well, carbon dating, it could be. It could be from the range of the carbon dating which was before the Prophet's lifetime. And before that, he was arguing that either Prophet Muhammad didn't exist or the Quran was invented after the time of the Prophet's lifetime. So Tom Holland wants the Quran to exist any time except the Prophet's lifetime, basically, right? That is, I would argue in my belief, an ideological bias by Tom Holland, okay? Whereas we have great evidence. There's not even multiple sects of Islam that believe in different Qurans. We had early splits in different sects of Islam, no different versions of the Quran. Our historicity is second to none, I would say, in terms of a manuscript from that age. And so mass tested, it wasn't just like the Christians where they had to go through 300 years without a government, and then they gathered their scriptures up where they could, and there was no central authority except the Roman emperor. From day one, we had an Islamic system of government that was implementing the Quran, and so had to basically have it there, have it implemented. So we didn't have to wait 300-400 years before a Quran was compiled. And so on.
Well, because there was different teaching, but it was right to wrong.
There was no different teachings. Please tell me where there are different versions of the Quran anywhere, and I will concede your point. Well, no. We have a lot of actual texts from, some people say from around the time of Uthman, the third caliph of Islam, and companion of the Prophet Muhammad, as well as the recent Mingan find. Please tell me where there are any variants of the Quran, this text, or some different inserted sentences, or different paragraphs missing like you have with the Bible. We don't have that problem, so I would contend that. As for the issue...
Traditions at the start.
Sorry?
It was all the same narrative all the way. It wasn't like different tradition before it came into a unified form.
Yeah, I would say it was consistent from the start, yes. That's why we don't have different sects. We had splits from the Sunni, Shia, and a group called the Khawarij, splits at the very earliest times in Islam, and they do not have a different Quran to the mainstream, Sunni group. Yeah, different color covers, maybe, and so on. Yeah. So, but anyway, as for theodicy, which is the problem of evil, I think I even dealt with that during this lecture. But if you want, we can discuss that further. But I would contend we don't have any problem with theodicy. We don't have any internal contradictions in the Quran. But that would require a separate lecture, or if you wish, a debate. And I have debated these very precise topics with different individuals, and I'm more than happy to do it again if anyone from any particular group or society wants to invite someone to debate me on this topic. I'm more than happy to. But I contend that those three issues don't exist within... Sorry?
Sorry, we can discuss this another time.
Okay, there is no problem with theodicy for Muslims and for Islam and from the Islamic viewpoint and cosmology. That was my point. Right? It might be a problem for certain Christian sects, perhaps, yes, but it's not a problem from us. We don't have a
Sorry, we'll answer that. Sorry.
I was just going to add on to that point. I think what he was trying to say at the time, I think this is what I understand, that after the revelation of the Prophet and after he passed away, when Islam was being spread throughout the land, people started coming back saying different versions of the Quran, but then I think that's when they had to make sure that... No. It was basically, there was a concern that Persians who were becoming Muslim, Arabic isn't their first language, they would have problems trying to basically memorize the Quran, and they were worried about corruptions arising in it. So to prevent possible future corruptions from non-Arabic speakers becoming Muslim and starting to memorize the Quran, which Arabic isn't their first language, and you have to ensure consistent teaching, they standardized a written form. Arabic language wasn't standardized at that point. There was no standardization of the written form of Arabic. You could spell a word in different ways. The same word could be spelled in different ways. So with the Uthmanic compilation, with the compilation of Uthman, a friend and companion of the Prophet Muhammad, they decided to standardize the Arabic language and then write the Qurans in the standard form of Arabic. You see, that's what happened. But there was no issues with, there was never any allegations of different versions. There was concerns that because many Muslim memorizers the Quran, or I mean memorizers, those who'd memorized the entire Quran, hundreds of them, all consistent with each other, memorization is consistent, they were worried that they would die in battle casualties in certain battles. And so it was time to actually put it down in a written form, actual written form. But Uthman's compilation demanded not only finding people's oral memories and going around and finding what they actually understand of it, but actually finding backed up written forms of it too. So for every verse that was going to be written in this compiled form, they had to find a large number of people orally speaking, that understood it and memorized it in that form, and they tried to find also written forms of it too to back it up. So, Zayd bin Thabit, who was the compiler, he himself had memorized the entire Quran, went out to try to find written forms of the Quran, because the Arabic language was not standardized at that time. Uthman standardized the Arabic language, and then the Quran was standardized because Arabic language was standardized. So that's what happened.
Take the last question on the gentleman on the left.
Sure, you have the final question. Make a good one, or contention.
We've got 10 minutes left.
So I have a slight issue with the way you talk about the approach to, say, materialism or approach to a lack of theism. You often talk about assumptions, like, for example, if I observe the universe and I don't come to the conclusion that there are supernatural forces governing the universe, I'm then making an assumption that there are none. Now, my issue with this is that if you apply a scientific or very strict philosophical method to how you evaluate the universe, then we don't really run into many of the problems that you've asserted exist. So, in fact, you require more explanatory power to to put weight on the experience of one man who asserts that he, was directly communed with by God or an angel. This is a very unlikely claim. It would require a lot of evidence, whereas we don't really struggle. If we look at the universe and we say, well, all I observe are these processes, there's no need to say, anything else is going on.
Okay.
It's not a big issue. And the other issue I have is that when you relate that to, I'm not quite sure how you got to the step that we must have an infinite imbuer of the universe, and I certainly don't think that you made a particularly good job of asserting that thing needs to have a will, because we certainly look at naturalistic processes that happen without being caused that we can understand, in a way that we can understand without them having will.
Example?
Nuclear decay. We don't have any mechanistic idea of why radioactive decay occurs, but we know that it does, and we on some level could say it's uncaused.
Okay.
But we wouldn't say it wills it.
Okay. So the second argument you mentioned, I'll do the first one afterwards.
A misrepresentation
Okay.
of naturalism and a...
Okay, let me go there. So the second argument you say is that there are many things we observe in the natural universe which are uncaused, and so why do we feel the universe needs to be caused? And I say, but I would call that, people say God of the gaps argument. I would say atheism of the gaps argument. You're saying that because we're ignorant regards to the cause of radioactive decay, this therefore proves that radioactive decay is just caused from nothing.
No.
So you're saying no, because let me clarify. Because well, your point was that you said that we can observe things in this universe of which they are uncaused, and then you cited. No, let me finish, sir. Let me respond. Well, you say we don't know anything about the cause. Well, then why are you citing the example? So if you're saying that radioactive decay is something where we don't know the cause, and you say that somehow can be used as evidence against the argument which says that every finite thing requires a cause, doesn't follow, because if you then I don't know why you cite that example. That example would have no relevance to your whole argument or counter argument, because what you're saying basically is that radioactive decay, humans are currently ignorant over the cause of it. So then why you bring that example? Because there are many things we're ignorant over, so I don't know why you want to bring something that we're ignorant over as any kind of argument for anything other than our ignorance.
What I said,
as for
it isn't necessarily a case of will. We don't see a mechanistic cause for this to happen, but we don't come to the conclusion. We wouldn't describe the nucleus as willing.
Okay, all right. So let me. Okay. So your argument is because we see a process, all right, which happens. We don't know why. We don't assume that radioactive decay happens because of will, right? But here's the thing. I didn't say, look at this object called God, and why does God do something? Or why does the multiverse or whatever this infinite thing does something? I didn't say that. I said, ultimately, I don't know how big the universe is. I don't know how big the chain of causality goes. I didn't make any assumptions on the matter. I said, ultimately, there has to be a first cause, because rationally there can't be any other possibility. I also said, rationally, this first cause has to initiate actions of its own volition, because rationally there is no other possibility. That's what I said. I didn't point to any object and say, that object does stuff because it chooses to. I never said that. I said that, ultimately, I don't know how big the universe is, I don't know how many other universes there are, or how many chains of causality there are. I didn't make any assumptions. I merely said that the only rational possibility, after going through all the other possibilities and discounting each and every one of them due to contradiction, I said that the only, let me finish. The only possibility, let me finish, sir. The only possibility that remains is something that is infinite and begins things to exist of its own volition. Nothing else would make any sense and would avoid contradiction or would avoid self-contradiction. That was my point, right? That was the only issue I made. So it was a rational argument on the ultimate cause. Now, as for the first point, which you mentioned, you say that.
Can I just come back to that point?
No. Let me deal with that, and then you can come back to my points, right? So the first argument you made was that I somehow attribute supernatural reasons behind phenomena in the universe. I never said that. I never said that at all. The things that happen in this universe, as the Quran tells us, look at how these things happen. The Quran tells us to look at how things happen, how the rain comes, how the mountains form, how the skies are there. It tells us to look at the how. So we don't, as a Muslim, say that there are supernatural reasons for the processes that happen. We just talked about causality, the ultimate cause of everything that's finite limited that exists. That is all. And it doesn't require great explanatory power as a Muslim, because anyone can come to the conclusion that God exists without being a Muslim. You don't have to be a Muslim to conclude that God exists, or this creator, this infinite, unlimited creator that creates by volition exists. You don't have to be a Muslim. You don't have to be a Muslim to conclude that our existence was intended. You don't have to be a Muslim to conclude that our ability to have consciousness and to think about this very concept we're having and to come to the conclusion of the existence of the creator was intended too. You don't have to be a Muslim. Which is why in Islam we believe that in history, people who are called hunafa, those who came to this conclusion purely through thinking about it themselves, including a lot of Greek philosophers, of which we study, who came to the idea of first cause without any revelation coming to them. So that was my point, and I think you misrepresented that point, because I accept. But here's the point. Here's the issue. If you deny a first cause, if you deny this first cause has volition, then you create a problem that requires greater explanatory power. So either you're saying that the universe will pop out from nothing is much more absurd and requires much more explanation than believing in a first cause. Or to explain that we somehow exist in a universe that was conducive to life. Why does this universe exist that allowed us to have life will require such an absurd explanation, such as the multiverse, of which there's a force that makes infinite universes, one of them which has unicorns, fairies, and goblins in it. That is much more. That is the counter argument. That is the only counter argument to the anthropomorphic principle, which is the issue that this. Well,
logically, I can explain why that's incorrect.
Well, I just spent the lecture explaining why it's incorrect too. So I would agree with you that it's incorrect. But sir, you have to concede that you're not the only atheist in the world. Or I'm assuming you're atheist. Maybe you're not. You're agnostic. But you're not the only atheist or agnostic in the world. There are others who say they are atheist agnostic, and there are these others. Amongst these others, there are those of great number who posit that argument as a counter to the first cause. So, considering that you're not the representative of atheists or agnostic, unless they vote for you, I don't know. But there are others who say it, and I have to mention it because it has to be refuted as an absurd point. The only alternative argument. Let me finish, sir. Let me finish now. I'll let you come back. I will let you come back, but let me finish. The only other argument that some atheists posit, except the multiverse, is, well, I didn't see the beginning of the universe. I don't know who created it. That's it. I will not have any beliefs at all beyond just universe exists. That's it. Ask no further questions. Right? It's there. We accept it. That's it. That's the only alternative point, and that is not even providing any explanatory power. That's just not having any explanation, full stop. You see? Because there is no other explanation other than an absurdity or one that makes rational sense. The third option is just not even saying, we ask no further questions. There's nothing before the universe, we just ask no further questions, the end. That's the only third option.
You don't know what happened, you can't prove what happened because no one knows. They're not saying that when you talk about it, they're just saying you can't know. You can't have God, maybe you can't.
We say, well, I did not say, I mentioned before very clearly, I didn't say that this universe, I know how it came about. Maybe this universe was made by a previously dying universe, right? I made no assumptions. Maybe there's a chain of causality billions of universes long. I don't know. I made no assumptions. I merely said, ultimately, at the end of all this, there was a first cause, because there's no other rational possibility. That's all I said. I make no assumptions in my points, but I merely said that there's no other possibility ultimately than a first cause somewhere.
Let's start with that question. The lady.
I just wonder if you agree with the statement that all of humanity share one purpose in serving our Lord, but we also have another purpose which is more individual to us that God has directly assigned to us. For example, whether it be to establish a certain charity or to fight a certain cause. Would you agree with this?
I would say that's a great question to link into the topic of Islamic or spirituality, and I think very pertinent, a very important point. When I mention about intent behind everything that exists, generally humans have a general intentionality, but because we are born in different circumstances and we have different capabilities and different powers and so to speak you yourself as an individual may have a very specific ability to contribute. But this contribution falls within the rubric of, so if you're here to do good, you're here to help the poor, those in need and so on, and you're in Nottingham in the 21st century, and you're born here or you're raised here and you have some means here, then what can you do here, for example? Or what can you do if you have the possibility to travel around the world and help people around the world, or to campaign for some political issues of justice against corruption and so on and so forth? That would depend on the individual experience. I would say that, in a way, every human being has the same purpose, and which I agree with you, but individually we have different circumstances. And so the circumstances that you're in determine how you should act if you want to pursue your purpose. The other choice is not pursue your purpose and just conform to your circumstances, like many humans unfortunately do. And so I think that's a very good and very nuanced point to bring up, and I thank you for your question. We all have a general purpose we have to follow, but specific circumstances.
That's a good way to close the evening. I'm sorry, brother. That's a good way to close the evening. I think we'll see you at 6 p.m. Thank you all for attending. We're going to social dinner today at 7:30 p.m. in the studio. This Discover Islam Week comes to a close with this event. We're honored to have Abdullah al Andalusi here today. We're honored to have We hope to see you all again. I apologize for my late jokes. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.